It was October 2021 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip into the foothills near Wallace, Idaho. I was 36 then. The weather had been strange that whole month. Quick to shift, one day warm and dry, the next cold and soaked. I had gotten used to those odd changes over the years. I liked going out alone for these trips. No distractions, no schedule. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I'd scouted the area during the summer and had found a decent patch of land near a stretch of mixed pine and aspen. It wasn't too far off the gravel Forest Service road, but far enough that I wouldn't see another person for days if I didn't want to. That was the whole point. I brought my usual gear. My old Remington 700, a canvas tent, sleeping pad, propane heater, lantern, and enough food to last a week. I also had a small radio for checking weather reports, though I rarely turned it on unless I saw clouds rolling in. I drove in on a Wednesday morning, parked the truck at the end of a narrow dirt trail, and hiked about a mile into the woods with my pack and rifle. I had a thick orange tarp over my bag because rain had been in the forecast, but the sky still looked clear when I set off. I reached my usual spot just before noon, a small clearing surrounded by sloping trees and a few granite boulders, half covered in moss. I pitched the tent under a tall pine that I'd tied a reflective ribbon to earlier in the year. I always used that tree as a landmark to find camp when it got dark. After setting everything up and storing food in a bear canister, I spent the afternoon glassing the area and checking for fresh signs, tracks, droppings, broken branches. There were elk in the area, though they moved around a lot this time of year. I found a few prints leading west from camp, so I planned to follow that direction in the morning. That night, it rained a little, just a light drizzle that tapped gently on the tent roof. It was actually kind of nice. I lay on my pad, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the soft rhythm of the rain and the occasional wind brushing through the trees. Nothing strange happened. I slept well. The next day was overcast but dry. I spent most of it hiking and scouting, not seeing much. I heard some distant bugles just before dusk, but they were too far to pursue. I walked back to camp by headlamp and had a hot meal from a freeze-dried pouch before turning in. The third day started out fine. Still no luck on game, but I wasn't in any rush. Hunting for me wasn't just about filling a tag. It was about the whole experience. The quiet, the walking, the fresh air. That evening, though, the wind picked up fast and hard. I could see dark clouds building over the ridge to the north, and I knew rain was coming again, maybe worse this time. I ate early and battened down camp before crawling into the tent. Around 9 or 10 p.m., the rain started, and this time it wasn't soft. Came down in heavy sheets, loud against the nylon. Wind shook the sides of the tent, and pine needles dropped constantly. I lay still in the dark, listening. The heater hissed softly. I didn't sleep much. Then, around midnight, something pulled me out of my half-sleep. I couldn't explain it at first. It wasn't a sound exactly, it was a shift, a feeling, like the atmosphere had changed. I turned off the heater and listened. The rain was still going strong, and the wind was gusting, but underneath that, I thought I heard something else. A sharp crack, not thunder, more like a branch breaking. It came from downslope, maybe 30 or 40 yards from camp. I thought maybe it was an elk or a deer, maybe even a bear moving through. I reached slowly for my rifle and laid it across my lap. I waited like that for a long time, maybe 20 minutes, just listening. Another sound came, softer this time, something brushing against a tree trunk or maybe rubbing against a bush. It was steady, deliberate, not the erratic stumbling of an animal, more like someone or something moving carefully, slowly. I felt my throat tighten. I've been out in the woods plenty. I've seen bears up close. I've had wolves come near camp. But this was different. It wasn't just noise. It was the way the sound paused and started again. Too purposeful. I flipped off the lantern and sat in total darkness, just staring toward the tent wall in the direction the sound had come from. Then I heard it, a footstep. Not the kind you hear from a four-legged animal. This was the unmistakable sound of a human boot pressing into wet ground. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My finger hovered above the safety. I strained my ears. Another step. Closer. I felt my heart thudding against my ribs, Not from panic, just from pure awareness. My brain was firing on all cylinders, taking in every sound, every change in the wind. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, in the rain, at 1 a.m, in the middle of nowhere. I waited for a voice, a flashlight beam, anything to explain it, but nothing came, just the rain, and then silence again. I stayed frozen like that for another hour, maybe more. The sounds stopped. No more steps, no rustling, just the storm. Couldn't sleep. My eyes stayed on the dark outline of the tent roof as I tried to process what I'd heard. By morning, the rain had eased into a mist. The forest looked soaked and lifeless. I stepped out, rifle in hand, and did a slow walk around the camp perimeter. The ground was soft, muddy, easy to read tracks in. I found them about 25 yards downslope. Boot prints, not mine. They came from the north side, between 2 boulders, and ended just before a thick patch of brush. There was a faint path pressed into the wet leaves, like someone had stood there for a while. Then the prints turned around and went back the way they came. Not in a hurry, just calmly. I followed them for about 100 yards until they disappeared into rock. Then I stopped. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was unsettled. I'd been out there for days. I never saw anyone. No vehicles on the road coming in, no campfire smoke in the distance, no empty shells, wrappers, or anything to suggest someone else was nearby. And yet someone had walked to my camp in the middle of a storm, stood close, then left. I packed up that afternoon. It wasn't that I felt in danger. I had a rifle, I had gear, I could handle myself. But I had no good reason to stay. Whoever that was, they knew I was there, and they hadn't made themselves known. That's what bothered me. If it were another hunter, they'd call out. They'd wave or say something. But this person had approached quietly, in the dark, in the rain, and left the same way. I hiked back to the truck before nightfall and drove straight into town, staying in a cheap motel off the highway. That night, the rain came again, hammering the roof like it had on the tent. I lay in bed with the TV on, not watching it, just listening to the weather and thinking. I went back up there a few weeks later with a friend. We checked the area again, found nothing out of place. No new signs of campfires, no gear, no trash, just silence. I still hunt, still camp alone sometimes, but I never went back to that exact spot. Not because of fear exactly, but because I trust my gut. And that night, in the rain, my gut told me that someone had come looking for something. Maybe just curious, maybe not, but they didn't want to be seen, and they made sure I knew it. And that's the kind of thing that sticks with you longer than you'd expect. Not the danger, just the knowing that someone stood there, quiet and patient, just outside your tent, while the storm raged around you, and didn't say a word. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone out in the woods of Colorado. It was late September of 2017. The idea had been in my head for a while. No distractions, no phone, just me, my backpack, and the woods. Life had gotten loud. I'd been working nonstop back then at a warehouse job in Wichita. Long hours, barely any time to think. The moment I got the time off approved, I packed up and drove straight west with no one knowing exactly where I'd be. I chose a spot called Elk Ridge. It wasn't a popular campsite. In fact, it was barely marked on the maps, hidden deep in the Route National Forest. I found it one evening while scrolling through hiking forums. Some guy had written about a peaceful, remote area he stumbled on while elk hunting a few years back. I saved the coordinates and figured I'd give it a shot. The plan was to park my truck as close to the trail as I could and hike a few miles in, find a quiet clearing, set up camp, and just be alone for a while. By the time I got to the trailhead, it was almost 3 p.m. The last stretch of road was rough, more like a washed-out dirt path than anything. My truck could barely handle it, but I managed to push through until I found a decent place to pull over off the edge. The air smelled crisp, pine, dry grass, and that earthy kind of cold you get up in the mountains once fall starts to settle in. I loaded my pack, double-checked everything: tent, stove, food, water, my Glock 19, just in case, and headed in. The trail itself was narrow and overgrown in spots. A lot of downed trees, some fresh elk prints in the mud, a few patches of snow from the week before. I remember the silence most of all. No wind, no people, just the occasional bird or cracking branch when I stepped wrong. Felt like I had the whole world to myself. About 4 miles in, I found a small clearing right off a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. It was perfect, flat ground, decent tree cover, and a little spring about 50 yards downhill. I set up my tent, got a fire going with some what I collected, and made myself a cup of instant coffee as the sun started to dip behind the trees. That first night was quiet, cold, but peaceful. I woke up once to the sound of an animal moving nearby, maybe a deer or a coyote, but nothing out of the ordinary. I rolled over, zipped up tighter in my sleeping bag, and went back to sleep. The second day, I spent mostly wandering the area. I followed the ridge for a while, climbed down into the valley, filled my bottles at the spring, and even found some old, rusted-out tin cans near a log. Looked like someone had camped there years ago. It made me feel a little less alone in a strange way. That evening, I noticed something that I thought was odd but didn't give much attention to. Around sunset, I saw what looked like boot prints in the mud near the edge of my camp. I figured maybe they were mine from earlier when I was walking around, or maybe they were just old. They weren't deep and the dirt wasn't wet, so it was hard to say how fresh they were. Still, something about them felt off. That night, I kept my pistol a little closer, just in case. By the third day, I started to get that feeling you get when you're being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia. I hadn't seen a single person since I'd gotten out there. No hikers, no hunters, not even signs of anyone. But that feeling stuck with me, like something was just on the edge of the trees, watching but not stepping out. I tried to shake it. I hiked a few miles farther out that day, looking for signs of elk or deer. The air was cooler and the wind had picked up. Leaves rustled all day, and I couldn't tell if the sounds I heard were animals or something else. I found more old prints along a game trail that afternoon. These were clearer, definitely boots, but heavy, larger than mine. I wear a size 10, and these were maybe 12s or 13s. That night, I stayed up later by the fire. I didn't light my lantern, just the flames and the stars above. The woods were quiet, like they were holding their breath. No animal sounds, no bugs, just me and the fire. I thought I saw movement once or twice in the distance, like someone ducking behind a tree. But I couldn't be sure. Could have been shadows. Could have been my mind messing with me. I slept badly that night. I kept waking up, straining to hear anything. Around 2 a.m., I heard soft crunching in the leaves outside my tent. I didn't move. I just laid there, heart pounding, hand on my pistol. Whatever it was, it stopped for a while. Then I heard a soft sniff, like someone inhaling through their nose just outside the tent fabric. I didn't move an inch. I must have laid like that for an hour just listening. Eventually, I fell asleep from exhaustion. When I woke up, the sun was already up, and everything looked normal. No prints, no signs of anything. I told myself maybe it was a raccoon, maybe a bear, but I didn't believe it. That day, I decided I'd pack up and move to a different spot, maybe closer to where I'd parked. I started breaking down camp. As I folded the tent, I noticed something half buried near one of the trees at the edge of the clearing. I thought it was trash at first, but when I walked over and kicked at it, I realized it was a shredded flannel shirt, dirty, sun-faded, and torn at the shoulder. I picked it up and saw what looked like a small hole in the chest area. Not a rip, something more like a puncture. Could have been from a stick. Could have been something worse. There was no name, no ID, nothing. Just the shirt, buried shallow in the dirt and leaves. I packed fast after that. The hike back felt different. I kept stopping, listening. I started marking trees as I walked, even though the trail was mostly clear. I didn't want to get turned around if something happened. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Around the halfway point, I found more signs. A broken branch, freshly snapped. Footprints in the mud that matched the ones I'd seen earlier. They were ahead of me this time, like whoever it was had been walking toward where I came from. I stopped for a long time, listening to the wind push through the trees, but I didn't hear anything. I kept going, moving faster now. I wanted out of those woods. When I got back to the area where my truck was parked, I froze. It was still there, but something was wrong. My driver's side door was cracked open. I hadn't left it that way. I knew I hadn't. I always check. Always. I crept forward, staying low, gun drawn. I checked the truck slowly, cab, back seat, under the chassis. Nothing. But someone had been inside. My glove box was open, papers scattered. My knife, the fixed blade I kept in the center console, was gone. So was one of my backup lighters. Whoever it was didn't take much. Just tools. I didn't waste another second. I slammed the door, locked it, and took off down the dirt road faster than I should have driven. Every time I hit a bump or dipped into a rut, I kept expecting to see someone in the mirror. I didn't. Back in town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I didn't know what to tell them. I gave them the coordinates, told them about the shirt, the footprints, the break-in. They sent someone out, but I never heard back. I called twice in the weeks that followed, but they didn't find anyone. No missing persons in that area, no bodies, no suspects. To them, it was probably just a drifter, maybe a hunter squatting out in the woods. But I know what I saw. I know someone was watching me out there, stalking me. I haven't been camping alone since. I still think about that shirt sometimes, buried shallow near the trees. I wonder if it belonged to someone who never made it back. I wonder how close I came to being just another story nobody ever followed up on. The woods are big and quiet, and if someone wants to disappear or make you disappear, they can. And nobody would know until it's too late. The air was dense with the earthy smell of pine and damp soil as we made our way through the thick forest. I was with my boss, Daniel, his wife, Clara, and her stepsister, Ivy. We had come to the small cabin in the middle of nowhere for a weekend camping trip. The cabin was tucked away on the outskirts of a national park, far from the nearest town. It was a place Daniel had been to a few times, and he'd invited us along for a quiet retreat. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. The drive had been long, and the dirt roads leading to the cabin were narrow and rough, but we finally made it. I could tell that Clara was excited, but there was a subtle tension in her face, something I couldn't quite place. Ivy, on the other hand, seemed indifferent. She was always like that, hard to read. As we unloaded our gear, the forest around us seemed to come alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, just a wooden structure with a slanted roof and a small porch. There was a fire pit in front of it, surrounded by a few logs to sit on. It had an old charm to it, the kind of place that felt like it belonged to another time. We settled in quickly. Daniel got the fire going, and Clara started preparing dinner. Ivy wandered off into the woods, probably to explore. I didn't think much of it at first. She had always been the adventurous one in the family, preferring to keep to herself. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I wrapped my jacket tighter around my body, watching the flames dance in the fire pit. We ate in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound that broke the quiet. The stars above were bright, more than I'd ever seen in the city. It felt peaceful at first, but the deeper we got into the evening, the more unsettled I began to feel. There was something about the silence of the forest that made my skin prickle. Clara seemed to feel it too. She kept glancing toward the trees, as if she expected something to emerge from the shadows. Daniel, ever the outdoorsman, didn't seem bothered. He was too busy tending to the fire, telling stories of his past camping trips. "Let's go for a walk," Ivy suggested suddenly, breaking the tension. She had returned from her exploration, and though her face was unreadable as always, there was a certain energy about her. The woods looked different at night. I didn't want to go, but I felt the pressure of the situation. Everyone else was up for it, so I reluctantly agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and headed off down a narrow path that wound through the trees. The woods felt different in the dark. The sounds of the birds and rustling leaves were replaced by an eerie stillness. The only noise was the crunch of our boots on the forest floor and the occasional hoot of an owl. The path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the woods. It wasn't long before I began to feel that sense of unease again, but I said nothing. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. We walked for what felt like an hour, the flashlight beams flickering as we moved. Clara kept close to Daniel, and Ivy led the way, her movements almost graceful, as if she knew this forest like the back of her hand. I followed behind, my thoughts wandering. Then something caught my eye, a glint of light off to the side, just beyond the trees. I stopped, squinting into the darkness. It was faint like a reflection, but it was there. I glanced over at Daniel, who was too busy talking to Clara to notice. "Did you see that?" I asked quietly, though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to. No one answered, but I could tell that Clara had heard me. Her head snapped around, and for the first time that night, her expression was one of concern. Ivy, still ahead of us, didn't seem to notice or care. She was walking with purpose, leading us farther into the forest. I had the distinct feeling that she was pulling us into something I didn't understand. Suddenly, the air shifted. A cool breeze rushed through the trees, carrying a faint but unmistakable smell. It was the scent of something dead, like rotting meat. I gagged involuntarily and took a step back. "What is that smell?" I whispered. Clara's face went pale. "We need to turn around," she said, her voice low. "Now." Ivy finally stopped, turning to face us. Her expression was blank, but there was something in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. A coldness, something distant and unfeeling. "We're almost there," Ivy said, her voice softer than usual. She had a strange smile on her lips, and her eyes darted between us, as if watching us closely. "Trust me." Daniel looked between Clara and Ivy, his brow furrowed. "What's going on?" But Ivy was already walking again, her pace quickening. We hesitated for a moment before following. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. We reached a small clearing in the forest. It was darker here, the trees so thick that they blocked out most of the moonlight. At the center of the clearing, there was a large rock, almost like an altar. Surrounding it were strange markings, carved into the ground, faint but still visible. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain. Ivy stood there, staring at the rock. "This is where it all started," she said quietly. "This is why we're here." Clara stepped back, her face twisted with fear. "What are you talking about?" Ivy didn't answer right away. She just stared at the markings, her eyes narrowing as if she was waiting for something. I wanted to leave, to run, but my legs felt like lead. There was something about this place, something that held me there, rooted to the ground. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a figure emerged from the trees. It was tall, thin, and barely visible in the darkness. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but it moved, stepping out from the shadows. My heart began to race. The figure was covered in tattered clothing, and its face, when I caught a glimpse of it, was pale, gaunt, and twisted into a grimace. "Run!" I shouted, my voice raw with fear. I didn't wait to see if anyone else was moving. I turned and sprinted through the trees, branches scraping at my face and arms. Behind me, I could hear the others following, their footsteps hurried and frantic. The sound of the figure's movement was close, too close. I didn't know how much time passed, but when I finally broke free from the trees, I found myself back at the cabin, gasping for breath. Daniel and Clara were there, but Ivy wasn't. I don't know when she stopped following us, but I couldn't bring myself to go back for her. I couldn't even think about it. The cabin door slammed shut behind us, and Daniel locked it immediately. We gathered in the living room, shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But nothing made sense. The figure, whatever it was, wasn't real, was it? The smell, the markings, Ivy's strange behavior. None of it felt real. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't something we could explain. And it wasn't something I ever wanted to face again. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We didn't sleep. We sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. but whatever had followed us was gone. At least we hoped it was. When the morning finally came, the sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm light over the forest. It felt like a new beginning, like we had escaped something terrible. But when I looked over at Daniel and Clara, I saw the same fear in their eyes. Ivy never returned. We waited for hours, hoping she would show up, but she didn't. It was as if she had disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. The thought of going out to search for her made my stomach turn. I didn't want to go back into that forest, not after what we'd seen. We packed up and left, not saying a word to each other on the drive back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting, and that maybe, just maybe, it hadn't been a coincidence that we had ended up in that place. As the miles passed, the weight of what had happened settled into my chest, and I realized that whatever happened that night, it had changed something in me, forever. It was August of 2016 when I decided to do a solo camping trip across parts of southern France. I had just turned 34, recently left a stressful job in Lyon, and I was in that weird phase of life where I felt like I had to get away from everything familiar. Too many responsibilities, too many people asking things from me, and I couldn't remember the last time I had a quiet night that didn't involve traffic, emails, or someone complaining about something. So I packed light, just a medium-sized backpack, my tent, my old hiking boots, and some basic gear. I wasn't going too far into the wilderness, just enough to be off the grid for a bit. Somewhere quiet. I had my eyes on a spot in the Parc Naturel Regional du Haut-Languedoc, near the southern central part of the country. It wasn't too touristy. There were trails and forested hills and places where you could hike or camp off-trail without being disturbed. I had passed through there years ago on a trip with my cousin, and I remembered how thick the woods were, how dark it got at night, and how silent everything felt. That was what I was after, silence. I started hiking out from a small town called La Salvetat-sur-Agout. From there, I followed a trail along a ridgeline that dropped into a thick forest about 6 or 7 kilometers from town. The woods were dense, tall fir trees, old gnarled oaks, and dense underbrush in places. It wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't the sort of place where you'd want to get turned around without a compass. I had one, along with a detailed map and a GPS unit that I only turned on when I really needed to check something. By early afternoon, I had found a spot on the western slope of a hill where the trees opened just enough to let in a bit of light. It looked like nobody had camped there in a while. There was a large flat patch of dirt under a ring of tall trees with dry leaves scattered around. No trash, no signs of other hikers. It was far enough from the trail that I wouldn't be seen, and I had a decent view down the hill toward a narrow gully with a stream. I pitched my tent just before sunset. It was a small 2-person one I'd had for years, nothing fancy, but it held up. I ate a cold dinner from a can and sat quietly for a while, listening. I hadn't seen anyone since leaving the trail that morning. It felt perfect, remote, peaceful, and a little eerie, the kind of solitude I thought I wanted. There were birds calling in the distance, and sometimes I heard something moving through the underbrush, probably deer or boars, both common in that region. I knew there were wolves in parts of France, but they stayed farther east and didn't come close to humans. By the time it was fully dark, I was zipped inside my tent with my headlamp off. I lay there listening to the soft sound of the forest. Insects clicking, branches creaking with the breeze, the faint trickle of the stream below. Then something shifted, a noise that didn't quite belong. It wasn't loud, but it was steady footsteps. Human footsteps, not an animal. I could tell by the rhythm, the way it paused and started again, how it circled wide before stopping. I held my breath. The steps weren't right next to the tent, but they were close enough that I could hear leaves being crushed, twigs snapping gently underfoot. Not a lot of weight. Whoever it was moved carefully, not like someone hiking normally. I stayed still for a long time, trying to figure out what to do. My backpack was inside the tent, and I had a small camping knife in one of the side pockets, more for cooking than anything else. I didn't carry a weapon. I never needed to. The footsteps eventually faded, going downslope toward the gully. I waited until I couldn't hear anything else. Maybe it was another camper, maybe someone hunting, though hunting wasn't allowed in that part during summer. Could have been a ranger. Still, something about it felt off. The quietness, the slow pacing, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I barely slept. I left the zipper half open so I could look out at the forest. The moon wasn't out, and the stars barely filtered through the trees, so I could only see vague outlines and shadows. Every little sound made me tighten up. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard something again. Same pattern, same slow movements. This time, it came closer to the tent. I stayed on my side, barely breathing. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, and I could just make out the sound of someone stepping slowly, very slowly, near the edge of the clearing. They didn't come closer. They just waited. I don't know how long they stood there. 15 minutes? 30? Then, just as quietly, they moved away. Not quickly, just the same slow, careful steps fading into the trees again. The first light, I packed up. I didn't eat. I didn't check the gully. I didn't even stretch. I rolled everything up, stuffed it into my backpack, and moved. I didn't follow the trail. I went a different way, trying to avoid backtracking toward town right away in case someone was watching. I moved fast and stayed off marked paths, checking my map and compass often, trying to keep my bearings. Around noon, I found another spot, higher up and farther east, near a dry ridge with rocky outcrops. It was harder to reach, but I figured if anyone had been following me, they wouldn't expect me to move that far that fast. I took a long break, drank water, and finally forced myself to eat. I thought about heading all the way back to the road and calling the trip off, but something stubborn in me didn't want to run. It might have been a hiker, after all, someone just cutting through, and I didn't have anything to prove, but I also didn't want to live in fear over something that might have been innocent. That second night, I stayed high on the ridge. No tent, just a sleeping bag and a tarp laid out between rocks. I made sure the spot wasn't visible from below. I didn't light a fire. I kept quiet, barely moved, and that's when I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, metal. A soft, scraping metallic sound, like someone dragging something along the rocks or brushing metal against stone. Not close, but not far either. Below, down in the valley somewhere. It wasn't loud. Could have been anything, a hunter with gear, someone with trekking poles. But the sound didn't move naturally. It started and stopped in bursts, like someone adjusting something heavy or repositioning a tool. I lay there all night, alert, watching, listening. I didn't sleep. At first light again, I moved farther east, toward a set of fire roads that weren't on the main maps but showed up faintly on my GPS unit. I walked fast. My legs ached, and my pack felt twice as heavy, but I didn't stop until I hit one of the roads and followed it north. By late afternoon, I found a campsite, not a commercial one, just a known rest area hikers use sometimes. It had a wooden shelter and a water spigot. Nobody was there, but it felt safer. Open. No cover for someone to sneak up. I stayed there that night. Finally managed to sleep a few hours with my knife beside me, tucked inside the sleeping bag. When I woke up, the sun was already up, and everything was still. I felt better. I hadn't heard anything during the night. Then I found the mark. On the edge of the shelter post, there was a scratch. A long, thin line cut into the wood, almost like someone had dragged the edge of a blade along it. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. I checked around the area. No prints, no trash, no gear, just the scratch. I didn't waste time. I followed the road out until I hit the main trail again, and from there, I pushed all the way back toward La Salvetat Surigao. I was tired, filthy, and hungry, but more than that, I felt drained. Something about that whole experience stuck with me in a way that normal camping trips don't. It wasn't just fear. It was the creeping feeling that I'd been watched. Not just once, the entire time, like I'd wandered into someone else's territory, and they were deciding whether I was worth bothering with or not. Back in town, I cleaned up at a small guest house, ate a proper meal, got some sleep in a real bed. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. What could I say? There was no proof, no name, just footsteps and strange sounds in the dark. But it felt real, too real, and I haven't camped alone since. Even now, years later, I think about that scratch on the shelter, about the footsteps, about the silence that followed them. Someone was out there with me, someone who knew those woods better than I did, and they never spoke, never showed themselves, never left anything behind except the quiet. And that's what still gets me, not the fear, not the darkness, but the silence, how nothing ever broke it, except the sound of someone moving just outside my sight, slow and patient, like they had all the time in the world. I haven't been back to that part of France since. Probably never will. I had always enjoyed camping. There was something about the simplicity of it. Being alone in the woods, the quiet of nature surrounding you, the fresh air filling your lungs. So when I decided to take a solo trip to Pine Ridge, a remote area just north of the small town of Three Rivers, I thought it would be the perfect way to unwind. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just me, my gear, and a couple of days in the wilderness. It was early autumn when I arrived, the kind of weather where it's still warm in the day, but as soon as the sun sets, the chill in the air is enough to make you pull your jacket tighter. The trees were just beginning to turn, the leaves shifting from green to fiery reds, oranges, and yellows. I parked my truck at the trailhead, grabbed my backpack, and set off into the woods. The trail was well marked, a simple hike that should take about an hour to reach the campsite I had in mind. But that hour felt different this time, heavier somehow. The air had that crispness that made me feel more alert, like something was just outside my field of vision. As I walked deeper into the woods, I started to realize just how quiet it was. The usual sounds of birds and squirrels, the rustling of leaves, were absent. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been in a place that felt this still. The only noise was the sound of my own footsteps on the soft forest floor. The trail was narrow, winding around thick trees, their trunks tall and imposing. It was like walking through a tunnel of nature. I had planned for a peaceful retreat, but as the daylight began to fade, I started to feel an uneasy twinge in the back of my mind. It wasn't anything specific, just a sense of being watched. Maybe it was the stillness, maybe it was the eerie quiet, but something felt off. I tried to shake it off. After all, this was supposed to be a getaway, a chance to relax, not to get paranoid. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. It wasn't pitch dark yet, but the forest felt like it was closing in around me. I set up my tent in a small clearing, the ground a little uneven, but it would do. I built a small fire, the crackling flames casting warm light on the trees. The night air was cooling rapidly, and I zipped up my jacket, settling into the camping chair I had brought with me. The fire gave me comfort, its warmth pushing back the chill. I ate a quick dinner, something simple, beef jerky and trail mix, and watched the flames dance. That was when I first heard it, a distant sound, a rustling like someone walking through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It didn't feel like it came from an animal. I sat up straighter in my chair, listening. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. For a moment, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably just the wind, right? The forest can play tricks on your ears. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The unmistakable sound of footsteps in the leaves. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight and scanning the area around the campsite. Nothing. The light swept over the trees, casting long shadows. I didn't see anyone, didn't see anything moving. Still, that uneasy feeling clung to me, persistent. I slowly sat back down by the fire, trying to focus on the flames, telling myself it was nothing. The night grew darker, the fire flickering lower. I added another log, the crackling sound filling the silence. I tried to ignore the feeling that someone or something was nearby. The woods were silent again, except for the occasional crack of a twig breaking underfoot. But the weird thing was, I never heard anything approaching. No footsteps, just that sudden crack of something moving, always just beyond the edge of my vision. At some point, I must have dozed off, the warmth of the fire making me feel drowsy. I woke up with a start, the fire still glowing faintly, but the air around me had changed. The temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath now, a misty cloud in the cold air. I checked my watch midnight, and then I heard it, a loud, unmistakable crack of a branch snapping. But this time it wasn't far off. It was right at the edge of the clearing, just beyond where my firelight reached. I froze. My heart started to race. Was it an animal? A bear? Person? The thought of someone else being out here didn't sit right with me. The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone on the trail. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hand shaking as I swept it over the trees. Nothing. But then, there it was, a faint shape, standing just outside the light of the fire. A figure tall and thin. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of someone standing there, motionless. My stomach tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call out, to ask if anyone needed help, but my voice wouldn't come. I felt like I was being held in place by some invisible force. After what felt like an eternity, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the night. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, the flashlight in my hand trembling. My mind raced with possibilities. Who could that have been? It didn't make sense. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, and the campsite was miles away from any roads. I'd seen no other vehicles. Eventually, my instincts kicked in. I wasn't about to sit here and wait for whatever it was to come back. I grabbed my gear, shoving it into my bag with shaky hands. I had no plan, no clear idea of what I was doing. I just needed to get out of there. I had to get away from that campsite, away from the feeling of being watched. The woods were silent again, almost too silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was following me. I moved quickly, my feet stumbling over rocks and uneven ground as I retraced my steps along the trail. My flashlight beam bounced erratically, casting weird shadows on the trees. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I walked for what felt like hours, the darkness swallowing me whole. I couldn't stop moving, couldn't shake the sensation of someone being just behind me, always out of sight. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in short, sharp bursts. I didn't know if it was the fear or the cold that was making me shake, but I couldn't focus on anything but putting distance between myself and that campsite. Finally, just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I reached the trailhead again. My truck was parked just where I had left it. I didn't even stop to think. I threw my gear in the back, slammed the door shut, and drove off without looking back. As I left the woods behind, the tension in my shoulders slowly started to ease. The feeling of being watched didn't follow me. The emptiness of the forest didn't stretch out after me. The long drive home was quiet, but I couldn't shake the images of what had happened. When I reached my house, I sat down on the couch, exhausted. I thought back to the figure I had seen standing just beyond the firelight. I didn't know who or what it had been, but I did know one thing. The woods weren't as peaceful as they seemed. Something or someone had been out there, and I would never go back to Pine Ridge again. It was the beginning of October when I decided to get away for a while. Just me and my dog, Shadow. Life had been a bit much lately, with work weighing me down and personal stuff piling up. A weekend in the wild seemed like the perfect escape. I knew that the weather would be turning cold soon, and I wanted to make the most of the last few days of mild autumn air. I packed the truck with gear, tents, sleeping bags, a portable stove, and some food for the weekend. Shadow, my German shepherd, sat in the back seat, his tail wagging, as excited as I was. He was always by my side, a faithful companion, and I knew the quiet of the forest would be good for both of us. The campsite was located in a remote part of the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. I'd found it online, a place not marked by many people, tucked away from the main trails. The directions were a bit vague, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to be far away from the crowds and distractions. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I set up the tent near a small stream, the gentle sound of running water creating a calming backdrop. Shadow immediately ran off into the woods, sniffing around and wagging his tail as if he'd found something interesting. I made a small fire, cooking some beans and rice on the portable stove. The scent of food wafted through the cool evening air, and I could feel the weight of the day lifting off my shoulders. Shadow came back to camp after a while, lying down next to the fire. He looked up at me, his golden eyes watching my every move. It wasn't long before night fell completely. The fire crackled, and the darkness of the forest closed in around us. The stars were bright above, and the moon, full and glowing, cast long shadows across the trees. I felt at peace, but there was something else there, too. A subtle unease I couldn't quite place. I shook it off, focusing on the fire and the warmth it provided. Shadow, who had been resting with his head between his paws, suddenly raised his head. His ears perked. His body tensed slightly, as if he had heard something. I scanned the forest, but all I could see were trees and the shifting shadows they cast. Probably just some deer, I muttered to myself, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The forest was eerily quiet, and there was something unsettling about it. The wind was barely stirring the leaves, and the usual hum of insects and critters seemed absent. I pushed the thought from my mind, focusing on the fire. Shadow slowly lay back down, but he kept his eyes trained on the forest. I wasn't used to him being so still and alert like this. Normally, he'd be content to rest, maybe catch some sleep. But tonight, he seemed on edge. I finished my meal and cleaned up, still trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my stomach. There was no reason to be worried, but the silence was unnerving. With the fire slowly dying, I decided to call it a night. Shadow followed me into the tent, settling down beside me. The canvas rustled in the wind as I zipped it up and pulled the blanket over myself. Sleep was elusive. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a noise, twigs snapping, a rustle of leaves, the faint sound of movement just beyond the tent. I couldn't tell if it was just my mind playing tricks on me or if something was really out there. At one point, Shadow suddenly jumped to his feet, growling low and deep. His ears were forward, and his teeth were bared. My heart rate shot up and I froze. The growl wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't a playful growl or one of his usual warning sounds. This was something else, more serious. "Shadow," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly, but the dog didn't respond. His focus was fixed on the dark forest outside, his body coiled with tension. I sat up, my pulse quickening. I reached for the flashlight I had placed by my side. Turning it on, I unzipped the tent flap cautiously, just a little. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the clearing around the camp. There was nothing except the movement of the wind and the occasional flicker of a distant branch. But Shadow was still on alert, his growling continuing, now louder, more forceful. Whatever it was near. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in the pit of my stomach. I grabbed my pocket knife and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I wasn't sure what I was preparing for, but my instincts were screaming at me to be ready. I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, listening to every sound that came from the woods around me. Shadow's growl softened, but his ears stayed pinned back, his body still tense. It felt as if something was watching us, something that wasn't just another animal, but something more dangerous. I wanted to call out to make sure Shadow wasn't just reacting to an elk or a bear, but I didn't dare. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I sat there, frozen for what seemed like hours. Eventually, I had to get up to stoke the fire again. The flames had dwindled to a low, flickering orange. I threw another log on, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was just imagining things. But the feeling of unease never left. As the night dragged on, I finally managed to fall asleep, though fitfully. Shadow, ever alert, remained by my side, his eyes open and watching the dark. When morning came, the air was crisp and cold, but there was a certain relief in the daylight. The fire was out, and I quickly packed up the camp, deciding I'd head out early. I wanted to get back to the truck and on the road before the strange feeling from the night before had a chance to settle in my mind. We packed everything into the truck, and I took one last look at the campsite, half expecting to see someone or something watching me from the woods. But the clearing was empty. Only the wind moved the branches, and the sun was rising higher. Shadow trotted along beside me, his tail wagging again, the tension in his body having finally eased. As I walked back to the truck, I realized how silly I had been to let my mind wander into dark thoughts. There was nothing out there, nothing but the forest and me and Shadow. We were alone, and that was all that mattered. As I drove back down the narrow, winding dirt road, the memory of the previous night slowly faded into the background. The forest had given me its share of strange moments, but in the end, it was just that, moments, not monsters. Just me and Shadow, surviving another night in the wild. It's funny how the woods always seem quiet at first. The trees tower above, their branches weaving together like a canopy, blocking out the sky. You think it's peaceful, but the longer you stay, the more you realize that it's anything but. That realization comes slow, creeping in like the mist that blankets the forest floor after dark. My name is Ben. I'm in my late 20s, born and raised in New York City, and I've never been much of a camper. But when I decided to go out to the woods for a solo trip, I wanted something different, something that would challenge me. I wasn't used to silence. The hum of city life had always been my background noise. So when I chose to spend a weekend alone in the woods, deep in a secluded park in northern Pennsylvania, I thought I could handle it. I packed my gear in the trunk of my old Subaru, left the city behind, and drove for hours until the roads grew narrower, winding through dense forest. The place I was headed, the Allegheny National Forest, was known for its vastness and its remoteness. I found a spot by a small, fast-moving creek that ran through the woods. There was a clearing just large enough for me to set up my tent and build a small fire. It was early evening when I arrived, the sun still hanging in the sky but beginning to dip behind the trees. The air had a crisp edge to it, hinting at the chill that would come once night fully set in. After getting the tent up, I gathered some firewood, trying to be efficient. I didn't want to mess around with the fire too long. The place was remote, and it would be dark soon. I didn't want to be caught off guard in the woods after dark, without a fire for warmth. Once the fire was crackling, I sat back, admiring the way the flames danced and flickered in the growing darkness. The creek's water flowing over rocks created a steady, rhythmic sound. For a moment, it felt peaceful, like the world had slowed down to match the pace of the water. But that peace didn't last. It was around 9 p.m. when the first thing caught my attention. A low, rustling sound came from the woods just beyond the firelight. It was too quiet to be an animal, not like the usual rustle of a deer or small critter. This sound was more deliberate, slower, like something was moving with intention. My first thought was that it was a person, maybe a hiker, maybe someone else camping in the area. I stood up slowly, careful not to make too much noise. The fire crackled, sending small embers into the air, but the forest around me seemed unnervingly quiet. I squinted into the dark, but all I could see were shadows, the faint outlines of trees against the night sky. No movement, nothing. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. The woods can do that. The quiet can mess with you, make you think you hear things that aren't there. So I sat back down by the fire, reaching for my coffee thermos. I tried to focus on the sound of the water, the snap of the fire, and the occasional chirp of a distant insect. But then it happened again. The rustling, much closer this time. It wasn't the wind. I could tell that much. It was deliberate, like footsteps, but too quiet, too careful. It was the kind of sound that told you something was out there, deliberately hiding from the light. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and shone it towards the sound. The beam cut through the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. The sound stopped abruptly, like whatever it was had frozen. I sat there, holding my breath for a moment, watching the trees. No movement. Nothing. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe it was an animal after all, a deer or a raccoon. I tried to calm myself, but the feeling of being watched lingered, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My heart rate quickened, and I realized I was clutching the flashlight too tightly, knuckles white. I tried to relax. I was in the middle of nowhere in a national park. There was nothing here but nature, right? I decided to take a walk. I wasn't going to sit around and get paranoid. I told myself I would just stretch my legs, walk to the edge of the clearing, and then come back. That was the plan anyway. As I stepped away from the fire, I felt the cool night air on my face. The sky was clear, and the stars were visible through the gaps in the tree canopy. It was beautiful, calming, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked for about 15 minutes, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and every now and then, I heard the distant chirp of an owl. Then, as I rounded a corner of trees, I saw something. A figure standing in the distance, at the edge of my flashlight's beam. I froze. It wasn't much, just the silhouette of a person, standing still, facing away from me. The figure was still and unnerving in its silence. I didn't make a sound, couldn't. The first thought that crossed my mind was that it was another camper, someone who had gotten lost or was walking in the woods at night. But then I noticed something strange. The figure didn't move, not even a little, just standing there, facing away. I took a step back, heart pounding now. I didn't want to approach. Something felt wrong. But what? Why would someone be standing in the woods at night, motionless? I took a deep breath and called out, "Hey, you okay?" No response. The figure didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me at all. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I forced myself to walk closer. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone who had seen my campfire and was messing with me. But as I got closer, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The person wasn't standing at the edge of the clearing. They were standing just past it, in the deeper woods, far from any trail. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. The park had regulations, and the area I was in wasn't a part of any known trail system. I kept walking toward the figure, the flashlight trembling in my hand. When I was about 10 feet away, the figure suddenly moved, jerking its head toward me, just enough for me to see a flash of something pale under the trees. I froze and my blood ran cold. The figure was wearing what looked like an old, tattered hoodie, but there was something strange about the way it moved, like it wasn't walking so much as gliding, its feet barely touching the ground. I turned around and sprinted back to my campsite, heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the clearing, I threw myself into the tent, locked the zipper, and tried to steady my breath. I told myself I had overreacted. It was just a person, just some weird situation. But the longer I sat in the tent, the more I realized that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. Something was off. Hours passed. I lay in the dark, the tent walls pressing in on me. The wind had picked up, and I could hear the sound of trees swaying. Every creak felt like a warning, every gust of wind like a threat. My flashlight sat by my side, ready if I needed it, but I didn't dare leave the safety of the tent. I knew I had to get out of there. By the time the first light of morning broke through the trees, I had packed up my camp. I didn't care about the rest of the weekend. I wasn't about to risk another night in that place, not knowing what was lurking just beyond the firelight. I drove back to the city, my mind racing with what had happened. I don't know if I'll ever return to those woods. The more I think about it, the more I wonder if I was just caught up in a strange coincidence, or if there was something else out there. But one thing's for sure, some places should stay unexplored, and some things are best left unseen. When I finally got home and looked at my gear, I found something strange. At the bottom of my bag, under a jacket, was a small, torn piece of cloth, gray, frayed at the edges. I didn't recognize it, but the fabric felt familiar. Maybe it was from the hoodie I saw, maybe not, but I kept it, because that night, I learned that some memories aren't just in your head. Some of them follow you, and some things, well, some things you can't shake.